Hi everyone, I know I've been focusing on the early post-World War II era a lot recently, and I do want to diversify our scope after this video. But since I've mentioned him a number of times across the past few videos, I want to touch on Frank Kameny briefly before moving on. I'm not going back into things we've already covered, but suffice it to say that, as we've said before, the late 1940s and the early 1950s are a time when the idea of identity based around sexuality is both exhilarating and terrifying for many people. Given the sheer number of people mobilized for the war effort, strictures that had prevented GLB folks from living openly more or less fell by the wayside at the height of fighting. Once the war drew down, however, the government, among many other institutions, tried to put everything back the way it was before. This effort tied together the rapidly escalating distrust between the US and the Soviet Union, though they had been on the same side during the war, with a generalized fear of homosexuals and communists. The beginnings of the Cold War and the rise of Senator Joseph McCarthy brought these marginalized people into the limelight in a pretty alarming way. Even before the end of the war, the military had used so-called blue discharges against gay service members, meaning that they were often barred from receiving usual benefits for veterans, like going to college on the GI Bill and using the VA healthcare system. This dismissal of gays within the military was of a piece with a crackdown on homosexuality across the government. Though better known for being the face of the Red Scare against suspected communists in the US government, Senator McCarthy also railed against other subversives like homosexuals. In 1950, he highlighted the resignation of 91 individuals from the State Department, most of whom were investigated for being gay, by questioning Secretary of State in a public hearing in the Senate. The purge of lesbian and gay employees from the federal government started before McCarthy, and continued on well after he had fallen from power. That homosexuality was automatically disqualifying was hardly limited to government employment, but it is symbolic of the suspicion facing GLBT folks at this time. Executive Order 10,450, signed by President Eisenhower in 1953, provided a simple pretext for government officials to investigate someone whose loyalty they question and to fire them if their job involved the interests of the national security. In practice, anyone's job was at risk, and people could be banned from getting any other government job permanently. Part of Section 8 of this order included a prescription against any criminal, infamous, dishonest, immoral, or notoriously disgraceful conduct, habitual use of intoxicants to excess, drug addiction, and sexual perversion. That last bit meant that government employees suspected of being gay could easily be turfed out with little recourse. And since the proceedings were publicized by media, these people would also have to contend with discrimination against themselves in the private sector. Frank Kameny worked as an astronomer for the Army Map Service in Washington, D.C., after a stint in the Army and after earning a PhD at Harvard. In 1956, he was arrested for solicitation in San Francisco while attending a conference there. Though the case was dismissed and his record expunged, Kameny became one of thousands of employees who was investigated and fired by the executive order. Unlike most, Kameny chose to resist his dismissal, waging a one-man campaign against the order and its enforcers. He wrote letters to pretty much everyone, ranging from his own supervisor to FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover to President Kennedy. Kameny even wrote a brief to the Supreme Court in 1961 after his own lawyers abandoned his discrimination case. And though his petition was denied, he managed to get the idea of homosexuals as deserving of first-class citizenship before the court for the first time. After leaving the government, Frank Kameny suffered a long period of underemployment. In a letter to a government official, he writes of a stomach which has only occasionally been properly filled in the last 8 months. He joined a group of other folks to form the DC chapter of the Mattachine Society, see episode 5 for details on that, and was elected president in 1961. Under his leadership, the society picketed the White House and Independence Day celebrations in Philadelphia, both in 1965, among other actions. Perhaps most famously, Kameny coined the phrase "gay is good" as a slogan in an effort to move away from the more euphemistic talk of the homophile movement. To Kameny, his struggle was to be seen as an individual by his former employer, the US government, not as a diagnosis. His chapter of the Mattachine Society prided itself on being more militant than others, and was the first gay organization to raise the issue of homosexuality as a mental illness to the American Psychiatric Association. Though I often talk about individual efforts, I think the great man theory of history is well overrated. Despite the fact that I focus on Frank Kameny here, he was just one of many people who shifted the movement from the genteel homophile organizations to the more militant gay liberation groups. Frank Kameny was ahead of his time in many ways, and he pushed the conversation that we as a country had towards more acceptance of sexual minorities. There's so much more to this story than what I can give in a short video, and while we will return to this era eventually, I encourage you to check out the depth of history that is provided down in the resources. As always, you can follow me on Twitter, you can follow the show on Tumblr, and don't forget to subscribe. See you next time.